Welcome everyone to the first Fashion Means Business Fashion Talks for 2022. We're joined today by Lavinia Fernandes. Thank you very much for joining us. She is a graduate from London College of Fashion and Fashion Business School from the Executive MBA. So thank you, Lavinia, for joining us today. I think our paths crossed maybe about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when you first came up with the idea of actually sort of demystifying some of the confusion that's around carbon footprint and how we actually classify carbon footprint, and giving customers more clarity on actually the true impact of what they wore. So thank you very much for coming today. Since our first meeting, you founded Blu-Label, and the focus of your talk today is to look at carbon labeling across the fashion industry, because I think you shared a statistic with me, something like over 100 billion fashion products are produced each year, and the global fashion industry is responsible for 2.1 billion metric tons of CO2 emissions.
That's correct.
So handing over to you, Lavinia. Thank you very much. There'll be questions at the end. So we'll leave plenty of time for that. So Lavinia, thank you again for joining us, and looking forward to
Hannah, thank you very, very much for that warm welcome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fashion Means Business Talks with myself, Lavinia Fernandes. I'm the founder and CEO of Blu-Label. And Blu-Label is a climate tech company working primarily with the fashion sector. And we measure the fashion impact on the environment of individual garments from crop to shop. So Blu-Label is a climate tech company based in London. We discover the carbon footprints of items from crop to shop, which means that we measure the energy intensity of garments and their materials from the creation of the fiber through the many stages of production all the way to the shop floor. And so carbon labeling, why is it important? It is impossible to tell the carbon footprint of a garment just by looking at it. There is a huge difference in the emissions load and subsequent climate impact of a garment made with locally sourced cotton, manufactured in a unit supplied with renewable energy and sold locally, compared to a garment made using cotton grown in the energy intensive environment with a high chemical load, transported vast distances to manufacturing units with using high energy intensive machinery, which has been powered by oil or coal-fired electricity. So if you're looking at a pair of jeans, for example, it is really difficult to know if that pair of jeans has been made in an environmentally friendly way, which gives you a very low carbon impact, or a very high intensity way, which is why we see a real value on putting a carbon label on products to give that choice back to the customer so that they are empowered to actively make that decision, where do they choose to put their money. So a little bit about us. I'm a former fashion buyer, also a former candidate of the Executive MBA program at the London College of Fashion. I also have a master's in fashion journalism. So I'm a former fashion buyer that never really considered the impact of the fashion industry on the natural environment until fashion rapidly sped up around 10 or 12 years ago. Fashion collections jumped from twice a year to 4 to 10 to as many as 12 collections a year. And I started to take a step back and really started to think and engage with what was happening, because I started to become alarmed with the sheer number of clothes that we were expecting people to buy in a year, and the pressure we were putting on customers to be considered fashionable and up to date. So this is where I had this mix between the fashion journalism of having to write to make people feel a little bit insecure to drive that desire to buy, and then being the fashion buyer that was engaged with buying huge quantities of items from ever increasing numbers of designers, trying to discover that niche buyer who hadn't yet engaged with that fashionable mindset. So creating consumption where there wasn't really any real need. And that really sat with me, actually, that we were creating this hunger and this appetite to have more and more clothing without thinking, where on earth are we going to put those clothings? You know, wardrobes at that time, 12 years ago, you know, when there were not these beautiful sharing business models, wardrobes are finite. Where does that clothing go? You know, and what is the concept of throwing something away? So we'll explore that later. So the volume of waste was growing with both post-consumer waste and pre-consumer waste. And I felt that there needed to be a better way for customers to start to assume responsibility for the environmental damage that they were causing by throwing clothes away, and also for the brands to become accountable for the material choices and their production methods. So our vision, just to go back to Blu-Label, we're on a goal to get to a fashion industry which is at zero. So zero emissions, zero extraction, zero exploitation, whether that's human capital or natural capital. We're really working to unite brands and shoppers to turn the fashion industry around from being the second most polluting industry on the planet after oil and gas, to being in a future fit position where actually everything is considered in how it's made, in how circular it is, what's going to happen to that material. Now that we've extracted it and we've put it out into the planet, what do we do next with that? So what is we are going to do next leads very smoothly on from measuring that carbon footprint, because it creates that awareness. So the problem statement, the main issue with carbon accounting, as you can see from the supply chain, I did a little drawing at the bottom here, where you can just see very simple version. You've got farmers, you've got logistics suppliers, you've got factories, you know, with denim, they're doing finishing, they're doing washing, they're doing the laundry. You've got the shippers who are moving things vast distances across the planet. You've got the headquarters and the design, the footprint going on there. You've got the packaging, you know, what is the packaging made from? Is it made from plastic? Is it made from fabric? Is it recyclable? Then the store, the footprint of the depot, what happens where, how long is that item sitting in the store before it's moved out? Then you've got that relationship with the customer. First of all, how does the item get to the customer? So if you look at how you're going to measure the emissions in every single stage, the main issue with carbon accounting is accessing that data. So high quality product carbon accounting is extremely difficult, as it involves a high level of collaboration and data exchange with supply chain partners and information that is difficult to measure. It's almost impossible to verify, and most of the times it's pretty confidential. So value chains are extremely complex. One fashion company we looked at was working with 938 suppliers. So they can be huge organizations. So when you're thinking about getting that quantifiable data in a cross-collaborational space, it's really difficult for brands to do this alone. And that's where that interoperability with bringing on a third-party technology solution provider like ourselves to take over that role of creating that bridge and that seamless transition of the data across the supply chain to only extract the data that's relevant to us to look at the emissions that have been created in the life journey of that product. So just going into, you've got a little image here of our digital carbon label. So that's a Blu-Label on the side there. So a Blu-Label is a scannable label. You can scan a QR code or an embedded NFC chip in a garment, and then boom, up comes an infinite label, which has got material origins, it's got goals like United Nations goals, it's got strategies of the brand, decarbonization strategies. It's really got a lot of sticky content there that will engage the customer in a meaningful way with what that carbon footprint means. Because of course you have the difficulty of communicating the findings in a meaningful way to customers, because a number such as 22 is meaningless without some comparative and explanatory information. So this is why we decided that the only way forward now for delivering this information about the carbon load of your garment is via a digital mechanism to have that infinite space where pretty much all the relevant information that you need can be stored. And then we have put together, we've got a B2C ecosystem, which is our app, which is in beta testing now, it's not downloadable yet, where we will group together all the items with a carbon label. So customers can shop according to carbon labels. But moving on to what exactly is a carbon label. So here I've got my PIM model, so our pollution impact to materials, which is what we look at to discover where the pollution lies. You know, what is the impact on the ESG, so your environmental, your social and governance. And in particular, we look at the material source. So what is a carbon label? It's actually a benchmark. So currently there's a really haphazard approach to carbon accounting. We use ISO standards, greenhouse gas protocol standards, as well as sector guidelines like product category rules, which is known as PCR, or a project environment footprint, so a PEF. But all of these leave significant room for interpretation because they are not a fixed set of rules, it's a guideline. So what's happening now is that people are cherry picking the parts which are relevant to them, displaying that information as a carbon footprint, and ultimately giving a very misleading piece of information. So the result is rather a chaotic approach currently in the fashion industry with unreliable and inaccurate carbon accounting, which, you know, what does it ultimately do? It impedes a decarbonization strategy, because if you don't know the carbon load of your item, it is really difficult to start working out whereabouts and how you decarbonize your products. So I've got a few little decarbonization strategies put here. You know, we look at circularity, nearshoring, you know, bringing your manufacturing back closer to where the end customer is positioned, looking at renewable energies, recycled materials where this is possible, upcycling in particular is something that we really support. We look at the fossil fuel dependency, how can we erase that? And then we're really exploring in a very meaningful way the material innovation space, because that is a really exciting one for us. And then of course we also do offsetting, but that is pretty much the, you know, at the point of last resort. You know, right now it's a very valuable and very useful mechanism for balancing out the carbon load of your materials, but ultimately you actually want this to stop the production of these emissions in the first place in the fashion chain. So what is a carbon label? Carbon label is a benchmark, but also moving on to the next slide, it's also a store of value. So as well as being a pollution impacts benchmark, a carbon label has this intrinsic value. It's a social value. So currently social value of a fashion garment is one centered on the status or identity it gives the wearer. We believe that in the future, this signifier value will be replaced by a social value, with brands leading that direction by working on transparency to build trust, working on garment longevity to increase durability, optimizing their supply chains to make fully traceable value chains, creating products with proof of impact identifiers to show that authenticity, and adopting a more future-aware stance, looking at products designed for the metaverse and the crypto shopper. So a carbon label is a mechanism to deliver all these different values, as well as being an impact benchmark. So then moving quickly on to the next slide, I have here just a few of the reasons why we're actually measuring the emissions on a product. So there is something called COP, which I'm sure you're very aware of. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties. The parties are actually governments, and they're the governments which have signed up to make a meaningful difference in climate change and what they are doing about it. So the most important COPs that we have as fashion professionals is Kyoto, where the 6 greenhouse gases were actually isolated, and they're called, they're known as greenhouse gases because they have an impact on radiative forcing, and they have something called GWP, which is the global warming potential. And this is how we see how toxic to the environment one gas is compared to another. So carbon dioxide is the most well-known gas, but we also have methane, and methane's potency is 20 times greater than carbon dioxide. And methane is the gas given off when garments start to decompose in landfill. So the toxicity of garments being thrown away is much higher than actually the toxicity of the carbon dioxide in production. So you've got Kyoto, where they isolated the 6 greenhouse gases, or ratified which the 6 greenhouse gases would be. And they introduced a polluter pays principle. So if you create the pollution and you're responsible, you have to pay for that. Except in our industry, in the fashion industry, you know, where does that responsibility lie? Is it with the end customer? Did they really create the pollution because they bought the garment? Is it with the brand because they've designed the garment? Or is it with the manufacturer because they're the ones who actually, in the majority of, we'll look at this a little bit later, but in the majority of circumstances, they're the ones who are creating the massive carbon footprint in the fashion industry. So then you have Doha, where emissions should be reduced by 18% by 1990, so a goal there. Paris, very well known, the Paris Agreement, 2015, the parties, all the governments who are subscribed to this, they have to declare their national determined contributions. So it's a cap on the amount of emissions that they will produce in a given 5-year period, and then that's renewed every 5 years. So incredibly important, Paris. And then Glasgow, still the jury is very much out on whether or not that has achieved anything, but its goal was to eliminate emissions by 2050. So very commendable goal, but it's yet to be seen exactly how that's going to play out. But yeah, I just thought it was quite important just to have a little look at, you know, why are we actually doing this? Why are we measuring emissions? So moving on to the next slide, we can have a look at the consumer's responsibilities. So where actually are these emissions created? So here, this is from a report on Swedish clothing consumption, and 80% here is put into, is accountable for production. And I thought this is really important to show this, because in this pie chart, the user is only really responsible for 3% in the laundry phase, which is really quite interesting, because the general rule of thumb is that the consumer contributes in life cycle analysis 40% of the emissions. So you've got 60% production and 40% consumption. But the reality is, the reason why I've put this here, you know, it says the average person in Sweden has an annual carbon footprint of 330 kilograms. We don't really know. We really don't know. So that figure has come from the number of people in the population, averaged out by the number of clothing which was sold. But, you know, 33 kilograms of carbon dioxide is the impact of a Levi's pair of jeans. You know, some pairs of jeans are 5 kilograms CO2e. It's really difficult to say what your carbon footprint is. So really, where does the responsibility lie? With the shoppers or the brands? So there are 2 types of emissions: the production emissions and the consumption emissions I mentioned earlier. And a carbon label will show the production emissions, whereas a full LCA will show the cradle to grave carbon footprint, which has an assumed carbon footprint of the garment in the use stage and in the disposal stage. So moving on to the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit more about the use stage emissions, so emissions with the consumers. So big fans of Shein, I'm sure not in the audience. We're living in an era of extremely cheap fashion, with the majority of fashion materials being made from polyester. Polyester production is the most energy intensive of all materials, requiring 10 times more production energy emissions in production than organic cotton. Over 60% of garments are currently made each year out of polyester, which is around 60 billion items of clothing made each year. And if you consider that the fiber lifespan of polyester is 200 years, it's quite staggering when you start to think about the impact of 60 billion items of clothing, because even though the fiber has a long lifespan, the garment most of the times doesn't. You know, if a hole is made in it, it's difficult to sew it up. You know, stitching comes undone. You know, these garments are not actually designed for a long life cycle. But if you think that methane is being given off for 200 years after you buy that beautiful pair of £3 shorts from Shein, maybe you'll think twice before doing that, and explore buying something made from a natural fiber instead. So moving on to the next slide, we'll look a little bit about the embodied carbon. So little design that I've done here, which shows the embodied carbon in production materials, your use stage, and the end of life stage. So embodied carbon is a term used to describe the carbon generated inside the garment. It is created at every stage of garment production and also during the use stage and disposal stage. We're currently the world's second highest exporter of fashion waste, where emissions are created in the gradual decomposition. To avoid these disposal emissions, we now need to explore beyond the life cycle stage, so usage stage, so upcycling and repurposing to avoid altogether disposal emissions. So the emissions on waste is a huge part of the fashion carbon footprint. Then moving on to the next slide, the embodied carbon crosses borders. Therefore, the mechanism for the introduction of a carbon tax is being hotly debated, because who is responsible and who is accountable? Who ultimately bears the responsibility for the cost of paying for the impact of carbon emissions? The producer, the brand, or the customer, which is also known as the end user. So why is this important in the conversation on carbon labeling? It's because we're moving to this position where, well, by 2040, every single item sold in the UK needs to be carbon balanced or at zero carbon emissions. But a carbon label, a carbon footprint, is a gateway to having that carbon tax. So your taxable amount, if you're buying an item with 10 kilograms of embodied emissions in it, then you may have to pay a taxable amount. It may be that taxable amount has already been paid by the brand, but then you would have to pay a taxable amount based on what you end up doing with the garment. It's all very, very hotly debated. It's constantly shifting, this carbon tax debate. Then very quickly, just to summarize, moving up into the next slide, I just want to talk very quickly about product carbon emissions. Where are they? Like, where are they created? Where do we look for? If I'm a brand, where do I look for where I measure those carbon emissions? So we've got scope 1 emissions, which is the brand's own directly controlled operations. Scope 2, which is the purchased electricity and what's happening with the grid. And then scope 3 is all the upstream and downstream value chains. So it's the production, it's the manufacturing, it's logistics, it's the packaging. And it also, in some instances with LCA, it looks at those consumption emissions as well. So when you get a life cycle analysis or an LCA product carbon footprint, it's going to show your scope 3 emissions, including the customer. And when you get a point of sale product carbon footprint, it's going to show those production emissions only. Finally, moving on to the last slide. No, it's not the last slide, a few more slides, but one of the last slides is I just wanted to show you Veja, I think that's how you pronounce it, with a sort of the Spanish J. They're doing tremendous work. So I didn't really want to walk away with people thinking that nobody in the fashion industry is doing anything. Actually, it's the contrary. Pretty much every brand is trying to do something. It's just the accuracy of that data and how they extract the data is extremely difficult. But if you look at Veja, they have got a very interesting study. It's downloadable in their annual report. But they actually claimed that within scope 1 and 2, that only 0.15% of their emissions have been created. So some people say that 90% of emissions are created within production, but Veja is actually saying it's 99.45%, which is really quite an astounding figure. But anyway, moving on to the next slide, I just want to say that complex value chains create significant challenges in the interoperability of the solutions for data collections. So this is where we come in. So we look at collecting that data from materials, productions, logistics, packaging, thousands of data points. Any carbon label has to directly address this challenge of being able to collect real data where it is possible, and then create systems where data can be collected in the future where it is currently missing. There are a lot of databases which people are currently using to look at the carbon footprint, but these databases are not complete. And so in the case of our industry, it's actually really difficult to use a database to get an really accurate view of what your impact is on the environment. As I said before, we've gone into and we've analyzed, actually in the next slide, I can really show you this. So this is Blue Matters. This is Eric's, it's a company in Turkey. They manufacture jeans for a lot of very well-known brands. And they allowed us to do a pilot on the emissions of their new machinery that they'd invest in. So the outputs, they're doing input-output table. And we were able to take really granular details. They handed us electricity bills, they handed us everything that we needed. They had product environmental footprints already conducted. So we were actually able to do a really accurate assessment of one pair of jeans. What's the carbon footprint on one pair of jeans? And when we measured it, we went back very proudly with the information, and they were a little disappointed. And they said, oh, we thought it would be a lot more. And I said, hold on a second, the volume that you make each year, the amount of emissions that you would save in 1 year would be X, but the amount of emissions you would save by 2030 would actually be just under 500,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. And with that piece of information, they were really pleased that their investment really made a meaningful change on their impact on the planet. So anyway, to wrap up, I hope that I have, go on to the final slide. Thank you, slide. I hope I have explained in 30 minutes exactly what a carbon label is, what its purpose is, why it's important, and why everybody should be looking out for carbon labels on garments, because they're going to start to pop up, and why every brand should be looking at measuring as much as they can the data so that they can start to work on moving that figure down to a zero position. So Hannah, back to you.
Lavinia, thank you very, very much. Yeah, I don't know if I'm, a lot of kind of cross messaging going on there. You have demystified the carbon footprint to an extent, but also reinforced how complex it really is. And, it's not easy for us to kind of quite merrily say, oh, I'm reducing my carbon footprint, when actually we don't know what our carbon footprint is. We have opportunity to take questions. So please do just add them in the chat. That would be great. Lavinia, I do have one question. You mentioned that we are the second largest exporter of unused clothes or clothes waste. Dare I ask who is the biggest?
Well, that is quite hotly debated. It is currently America, but it's difficult. It's difficult to tell, but yeah, it's America.
Okay, so it's a pretty frightening statistic. And I think also,
it's very close to Japan though, so it's America and Japan is, yeah.
Okay.
Which is interesting because Japan obviously is much smaller.
Yeah.
Population-wise.
Pretty good at recycling as well. Yeah, so I suppose also, you've spoken about the carbon footprint of sort of manufacturing and shared some statistics with us. I think what is perhaps also something that we don't know enough about, and this can be our responsibility as consumers, is that carbon footprint after we've finished using the product, and actually buying a bit more kind of carefully and with a bit more consideration, and thinking a bit more about longevity of our purchases, rather than, just that top to wear for the weekend and then put it away to never be worn again, or throws away more scarily.
Well, it's really interesting you're saying that, Hannah, because I very deliberately wore my favorite jacket here, which I actually bought 27 years ago.
You're showing your age
quite
now.
Frightening when you say that. It's a Stella McCartney jacket that I very proudly bought in the sale, but it is a really good example of something that hasn't too much gone out of style, is still wearable, you know, it hasn't, there's nothing wrong with it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So I think it's also about the responsibility that we have as customers about really starting to really engage with what we buy in a meaningful way, and just reducing that amount of clothing, and also looking very much so at you know, okay, so we buy a certain number of items new each year, but maybe setting that challenge, you know, it's like a TikTok challenge. Okay, so for every new item, the next one's going to be something that was reselled, you know, and just start to be a little bit tighter, you know, swap, share with your friends. There are many, you know, it's really acceptable now to you know, you need a dress to go out to a certain thing, call a friend and see if you can borrow something from there. But we do really have to look at the sheer volume of items that we're buying each year. And if you look at the history of garments, garments traditionally would last for 3 generations. And so now it's almost as if they last for 3 months. And it's not only because they disintegrate, but it's because we get tired, we get bored of it. You know, fashion's about excitement. It's about going, oh, you know, like I want to treat myself, like something great has happened. I just want to go and get like a new pair of shoes or something like that. And that reward mechanism, you know, we have to work as consumers, we have to work at breaking that. You know, why should we associate that treat with something as temporary as a fashion garment? So it's 2 things: looking at what you're buying, thinking how long am I going to be able to wear that for, obviously also thinking about how you dispose of things at the end of life, but just buying less. Your wardrobe is a finite space unless you're constantly reselling, but it's finite. And I think people need to engage with that a lot more. Like, okay, this, you know, item of clothing that I'm buying, is it for one purpose? Is it for 1 year? Is it for 10 years? You know, how long am I going to love it? You know, also get to know you, your identity. You know, are you somebody that switches and changes very, very often? Or are you somebody that goes, actually, I'm happy with the way I am in this role, you know, so whoever I am dressed like today is pretty much my style. So discover your style.
And maybe if you are that person who likes to swap and change, maybe going down the rental route is perhaps more advisable in that case. We had a talk from Ashita who's a founder of By Rotation. So it's very much, you know, you referred to that special dress that you might invest in, but perhaps only wear once. You know, it's about sharing and borrowing and renting from others. Those kind of key pieces. We have quite a few questions coming in.
Great.
So I'm just going to sort of start on those. So the first question that's coming is actually anonymous, but they're asking, do you have currently have any carbon footprint data on brands?
Yes. Shall I expand on that?
Yeah, maybe expand on a little bit, because, well, I sort of know we've had quite a few conversations, haven't we? But yeah, maybe if you could expand on that and the sort of process that Blue-Label is going through, and sort of maybe adding to the number of brands that you have that carbon footprint information on.
Yeah, so I mean, we're an early stage company. We're in startup phase, but we did a huge number of pilots last year, and we worked with some really known, well-known fashion labels. You know, hopefully some of them are joined today. Hello, if you've joined. And what we did is that we didn't look at the entire collection. So we just cherry-picked 1 or 2 items, and then we said, okay, so look, which one do you really want to understand the carbon footprint on? So we're actually collecting, it's a very good question in a way, because we're a blockchain-based company. So we have the capacity to have a limitless database. And so we are collecting all of that information. And by applying, you know, this is where it gets quite technical, but applying that artificial intelligence layer with machine learning, the way that Blue-Label works is that the future position is that we will be able to recommend to brands how to design better for circularity, where, you know, what to avoid, not necessarily which manufacturers to avoid, because that's not really very helpful, but just to look at the bigger picture and just say, look, this is your carbon footprint, this is the amount. So for example, for one brand that I sent the details through yesterday, they work with leather, they have a very high carbon footprint, but they but that's from the materials. But they were also using a lot of energy in the transportation of their goods. So just a quick win would be, okay, so let's look in isolation at transportation. Let's reduce this. They also had plastic packaging. So, you know, eliminate that is not really necessary. So yes, so we do have, we have a store of, ever expanding store of data.
Yeah, and I suppose it's not easy for a brand to make those changes overnight. So, you know, I suppose you could focus on where you are, perhaps where your carbon footprint is highest, and, you know, where you could perhaps improve on that carbon footprint without sort of compromising the finished product.
There's so many different ways. Like some people are sending, you know, as soon as they're finished, they're sending them like individually, you know, from China to the UK, or in small boxes. You know, if you actually press pause and can delay and have them sent all together, you know, that's really important. Also other things like pre-ordering, you know, having a sample, putting it on, you know, Instagram or something like this, and then just say, you want it 3 weeks, you know, are you prepared to wait 3 weeks? People are. So that's,
yeah, we've seen a lot of luxury brands.
There's so many ways. Like I would be talking forever if
yes, yeah, okay. So there's a question around sort of that carbon footprint data, and, you know, whether it's available publicly or via subscription, or how you're going to share that information. I suppose I'm assuming that's kind of with the consumer, so they can make conscious consumption decisions.
Exactly. So it's positioned on the digital label. So this is the power of the digital label, that I don't really, I find it very difficult to understand, even I, and I work in this space, if I see a carbon footprint on a pair of jeans, I would say pair of jeans, but, you know, if I see it on a pair of jeans, I find it really difficult to understand, like, how, you know, how is that, like, maybe that's a journalist to me. I just really want to know, like, what's the information behind the number? What does it mean? You know, was it like 1 kilogram was from the material, and then 90 the rest of the other 90% was from the packaging? You know, how does that figure break down? You know, how does it become meaningful? And then when you ask, is that data going to be publicly shareable? Well, it will be, because it's broken down on our labels. So we break down, we put them into silos. We've got 10 different areas of impact. So we look at the agroecology, you know, what's the soil carbon in the case of cotton, so many different parameters that the customer then has access to. It's displayed as an icon. They click onto that, they get some more information. But also we have the product carbon footprint overall, or in progress, which is most of the time it's in progress, because we can only collect emissions on certain areas. So as said, transportation, you know, we have an amazing calculator which is based on UK conversion factors, where we can actually break down the, if you give us a vessel number of a boat, for example, we'll know what fuel that boat was using. You know, was it bunker fuel, which is, you know, very heavy, thick, dark crude oil, or was it, you know, a much lighter fuel, which is much more energy efficient? So there's so that data sharing, is it going to be open sourced? Yes, we're not ruling it out, but it's confidential for the brands. So yeah, that granularity maybe is not so necessary.
Yeah, and you kind of spoke, well, sort of alluded throughout your talk about brands that are sort of greenwashing, you know, that are saying that they're carbon neutral or like have a low carbon footprint, but perhaps with limited justification. There's actually a question here whether or not there's a brand called Sheep Inc. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they talk about regenerative wool, and they are saying that they're actually a carbon zero brand. Do you think what they're doing is, are you familiar with them, Lavinia? Maybe you're not. It's just a question.
Yeah, no, I am familiar with it, but not, you know, I haven't worked with them, so I can't really comment too much on that. Yeah, no, I mean, the thing is like, it's like a whole new vocabulary. That's the thing, you know, when I talk about, I demystify, I sort of break it down into a meaningful way. I've had conversations with people where the words are just like that long, and, you know, regenerative this, and, you know, obviously it is really important, but it's basically how it's done. It's very difficult where we are standing right now today, because there's a lot of bad metrics out there, and I think that's basically what Blue-Label is all about. It's about collecting the real data. When I say bad metrics, just to go slightly off your topic, with the wool industry, for example, you can look, and I think it's a WRAP study which says that wool has a higher carbon footprint than polyester. And then when you break it down, like, how are the polyester figures coming out? Well, actually, it's once the oil has already been refined. So what is oil? You know, it's hydrocarbons, it's fossilized skeletons, you know, thousands of years ago, which has been extracted out of the ground. But it's not just the extraction. You know, I really explored in the oil and gas industry by looking at BP reports. How is it that oil is extracted? You know, they go to remote areas, they take huge numbers of people, huge numbers of machinery. When they extract the oil, they do something called flaring. They burn off, you know, huge quantities of gas rather than capturing it, and then it gets shipped elsewhere, and then it gets refined, and, you know, all of that is not in your polyester figure. And actually, a recent report that came out that says that they think that the figures that they have on oil extraction anyway is wrong by as much as 300%. So we really don't know. That's why I like to say that polyester is unquantifiable. It is in a huge number of our items that add stretch to garments. It's in sportswear, it's performance wear. It's very difficult to not have that now, because fibers are very mixed. So we're very comfortable with having cotton that doesn't crease so much, because it's got a percentage of polyester in it. So it's very difficult. I think I've gone really off your topic of the sheet.
Yeah, no, actually, that leads me on to the next question, because I've got a question here from Astrid, who's asking, are there any kind of tools available? But I think I probably know the answer to this question, because it's sounding very complex to actually sort of work out the carbon footprint. But Astrid is asking is whether there's any tools available to those wishing to find out more about how sustainable is product that they're buying. So, you know, if you're actually wanting to be sustainable in your purchasing, you know, how can you actually figure that out, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, I think that the easiest way to do it is that, are there any tools? I mean, we have a calculator on our site that we give for free. It's just a very light touch of our calculator. I think it's still quite difficult to ascertain what is the true carbon footprint from using any of those calculators that are out there, because, as I said before, you know, the carbon accounting is chaotic and misleading. But if you really want to know what your impact is, not necessarily your climate impacts or your carbon footprint, but if your garment has got a certification, has got a trust label on the material. So if it's got certified cotton, for example, you can actually go onto the GOTS website and you can type in the number on the label or inside the garment, and it will give you some information of where in the world that cotton has come from. And it's really important to sort of start thinking about, what is your material origin? You know, was your cotton grown in America? Was it grown in the Punjab? Was it grown in Zambia? It's really important you know that. For example, when I talk about bad metrics, and they say cotton, shouldn't buy cotton, it's water footprint, you know, the fashion industry uses, you know, not only is it accountable for in between 2 and 10% of global emissions, it also consumes 20% of the world's fresh water. But if you look at cotton and say, well, cotton's a very thirsty plant. Well, it isn't if it's from Africa, because it's rain-fed. And so you have to really look at that information that you're getting and start to, well, this is what the Blue-Label does. It gives you that information, but you really have to start to question where things come from. But the first thing you can do is look for that certification mark on the materials.
I don't think I realized that you could actually just key in the product code, which you find on the wash care label, to actually, if it's certified.
Only, yeah, well, with GOTS you can. FSC is another good one. So that's Forest Stewardship Council. So that's for viscose. You know, a lot of materials are actually cellulose based, which means they come from trees, they come from wood. Then you have to think, okay, well, where did that wood come from? You know, is it the Amazon? You know, am I cutting down the Amazon for my t-shirts? You know, it starts, you know, and then you think, okay, well, I'm buying this like bamboo, viscose, you know, wonderful like silk-like kind of material, but it's cutting down the trees in, you know, the lungs of the world, you know. So you have to think a little bit about the material origin.
Yeah. There's a question here from Emma. If there is one sustainable initiative for fashion brands to change, in your view, what would it be?
I think, oh God, there's so many. What a great question.
Yes, I think that's a very hard question to answer.
I love upcycling. I mean, I just hate the fact that 91% of all resources extracted are thrown in the bin. I mean, I just hate that. So I just think that we should be making clothes out of, you know, curtains or anything that we've got, you know, that I actually darn really badly, but everything that's got a hole in it, we've got crazy moths here. But I like the fact that it looks horrible. I like that imperfection, because it looks like, you know, I love it so much. So what? It's got a hole in, I fixed it. You know, it doesn't let the drafts in anymore. Get used to seeing things which are repaired. So upcycle things, you know, customize. You want something new, go out and customize your denim jacket or the things that you already have. Consider all that waste which is going out, post-consumer waste you can get hold of. As I said before, you know, things like curtains. And another thing that I have an issue with the fashion industry is this term responsibly sourced. Because when I first started Blu-Label, I was calling up brands just saying, oh yeah, you know, like you say you're responsibly sourced, you know, how, you know, what do you do for responsibly sourced? And they said, yeah, we were talking on the phone with somebody and they said it was responsibly sourced. And or they say, oh, it's dead stock, which is responsibly sourced, but it's kind of just a little bit misleading. If something's responsibly sourced, I kind of feel like the sheep has had a very long and happy life. and it makes me think of a different way. So I have worked a lot with the Competitive Markets Authority on you know, greenwashing in the fashion industry, and it is very, very difficult to jump up and down and say we've all got to be wearing organic cotton, when the poor organic cotton farmer, you know, his farm friend, you know, 200 miles away says, God, there's locusts coming. You've got to spray your crop. You're going to lose all your crop and your family will starve. Very difficult to say, okay, we have to have organic cotton at whatever cost, because we can't also enforce poverty. So it's a balance. And we're just in that transitional space. We're moving forward, trying to discover what is the best thing that we can do right now.
Just on that, you spoke about sort of, you know, repairing your garments and sort of extending their life. There's just a really nice message actually that's been put in the Q&A from someone called Ria, and she recalls when you were upcycling fabrics and garments in your living room, and that to then set up a brand for upcycling garments for red carpet. So she's just saying a big thank you. I think probably, you know, generations, the younger generation, you know, if we look at older generations, they always used to repair, and that was something that, you know, everybody knew.
It's normal.
Yeah, I think that's probably a skill that we. So
yeah, that's the Blu-Label project actually, is to insist that darning and sewing is taught in school, in primary school. You know, we have to get away from this mindset that your pair of socks has got a hole in, so you throw them away, you get another pair. We have to move away from that. You know, if you've got something which is made out of cashmere or wool and it's got a moth hole, it's not fit for the bin. There's all sorts of things you can do with that sweater. As I said, you know, I repair things, you know, I'm horrible at sewing, but I still do it. And I think that's the important thing. It's like we take away that judgment. We don't sit in judgment on things needing to be perfect. That imperfection is the beauty and the value that we take moving forward, I think, in this new in the future position of fashion, because we all know where the fashion industry is right now. It's the second biggest polluting industry in the world. Where is it going to be in the future?
Yeah.
You know, we really have to consider
Yeah.
what it is that we want to have happen to our planet, and what impact we want to have. Do we want to be walking around in clothing made from polyester with mountains of fabric piling up in the Atacama Desert? You know, is that really what we think about when we go shopping? At the moment, it isn't. So
so be responsible for our actions, and a bit more mindful in our purchasing. Question here about is your app available, and if so, where?
Well, that fun place called the Apple Store. But
someone's just had a little look on the Apple Store, but couldn't.
Yeah, it's not. It's in something called Test Flight, which is by Apple, because it's in beta testing. So okay. The issue that we have with the app, it's beautiful and working. It's just that we don't have the brands with the carbon footprints. So we're switching everything to put it all in progress so we can launch the app, because that's really nice. It's just a really, you know, it's great actually. It's designed for emerging designers. It's designed for students as well. It's, you know, if you're selling clothes, you know, between each other, and you want to upcycle them, you know, and you're selling on Instagram, you know, why don't you sell on this marketplace? And we work with very sustainable brands, but we also don't take too many of their items, because it's very curated marketplace. So it's got a very nice look and feel, but the hidden message is, you know, upcycle. So we really support. So if you are watching right now and you're upcycling clothes and you're selling them on Etsy or something like that, you know, the Blu-Label would be for you. You know, that in my pitch deck, I think I have my email address at the end. You know, please do get in contact. But, you know, very soon Blu-Label will be launching. Not quite.
Brilliant. Yeah, to be confirmed, but imminent almost.
Well, it's just been sitting in a testing phase. As we're just thinking, we've come up with a concept for a product carbon footprint app, and you know, how many items are we really going to have on there? So I think, but there's so much other information that we have, and also the product carbon label that's now being rolled out. So these digital labels, you'll start to see QR codes on labels, on logos. We do have a cardboard tag which has got a QR code on it. You know, that's, some brands will have that, but we're starting to roll out Blu-Label. So in the future, you will see it. Hopefully, you'll see it.
Really exciting times. Another question just about keeping in touch with Blu-Label and perhaps knowing what's going on. Do you have any social media accounts that those attending today could follow, just to sort of?
Yes, we don't. We haven't really been keeping them updated. Very active on LinkedIn because of the nature of our business. We've been a sort of a B2B and approaching brands in a very subtle way. You know, our website is not, you know, is not the greatest of websites. It's not particularly clear, just because we've been in this sort of consultancy phase with the business before we open it out to be able to scale to deploy at scale quite rapidly. We are looking for people to run social media. So yes, you can find us on social media. You can find us on Instagram. But if you want to, anybody looking for an internship, you know, opportunity to work with a sustainable company, please do get in touch.
Yeah, that was going to be my next point, actually. I'm sure there's lots of eager students that would be very keen to get involved. And then just last but not least, before we close the session, really, we've had some really lovely comments, actually, Lavinia, to say thank you, and really interesting and some great information sharing. But the question, I suppose, is directed more at me. The talk will be available after this session, not imminently, but in a couple of weeks. It will be available on the Fashion Business School Voices webpage. We have recorded the session, so if any of you would like to revisit and just relearn, there's a lot of information that you shared there, Lavinia. Maybe people want to have a bit of time to look through your charts and tables and statistics you shared. So thank you very much, Lavinia, for joining us today, and wish you lots of luck with Blue-Label, and looking forward to seeing that label appearing on garments, and for us to soon have greater transparency on carbon footprint. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Hannah.
Take care. Thank you, everyone.